The rain poured relentlessly over the city of Seattle, casting a grey haze across the skyline. Alessia Alvarez tightened her coat against the chill as she clutched her daughter Heidi's small hand. The damp streets reflected the glow of streetlights, and Alessia couldn't help but feel like the city itself mirrored her own struggles, drenched, heavy, and desperately in need of warmth. Alessia had spent the last few weeks knocking on doors, attending interviews, and sending countless resumes, all with the same disheartening outcome: rejection. Bills piled up at home, her rent was overdue, and her landlord's patience was wearing thin. Her 6-year-old daughter Heidi was the only reason she kept going. Alessia had promised herself that no matter how hard life became, she would give her little girl a better future. Today, however, offered a glimmer of hope. A friend had recommended Alessia to a prestigious nanny placement agency. The job was unconventional, a live-in position caring for a 7-year-old boy from a wealthy family. The catch? The boy, James Chandler, was notorious for being impossible to handle. "Don't let it scare you, Alessia," her friend had said. "You're tougher than you think. Besides, they're paying a fortune." The thought of a stable paycheck was enough to push Alessia into accepting an interview at the Chandler estate. As she stood at the gates of the sprawling mansion perched on Queen Anne Hill, Alessia took a deep breath. The iron gates loomed before her, ornate and intimidating, as if challenging her resolve. She glanced at Heidi, who gazed wide-eyed at the grandeur. "Wow, Mom," Heidi whispered. "Is this where the king lives?" Alessia smiled faintly, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "Something like that, sweetheart. Let's see if they'll let us in." A sleek black car pulled up, and a man in his early 40s stepped out. His tailored suit and confident stride matched the air of the mansion. Alessia immediately recognized him from the portfolio the agency had given her. Chandler, the boy's father. His eyes were sharp but tired, carrying the weight of a man who had built an empire and lost a piece of himself in the process. "Ms. Alvarez?" he asked, extending a hand. His voice was formal but not unkind. "I'm Chandler. Thank you for coming." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Chandler," Alessia replied, shaking his hand. Her voice betrayed a hint of nervousness, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "And this must be Heidi," Chandler said, glancing down at the young girl. His tone softened. "Welcome." He gestured for them to follow him inside. The grand foyer was as opulent as the mansion's exterior, with marble floors, a crystal chandelier, and walls adorned with artwork that likely cost more than Alessia's entire life savings. Heidi clung to her mother's side, awestruck by the splendor. Chandler led them to a cozy sitting room where a cup of steaming tea awaited Alessia. He gestured for her to sit and wasted no time delving into the details of the job. "My son James is spirited," Chandler began, choosing his words carefully. "He's had trouble adjusting since his mother passed away 2 years ago. We've had a series of nannies, none of whom stayed longer than a few weeks." Alessia nodded, sensing the strain in his voice. "I understand that children often act out as a way of processing loss," she said gently. Chandler studied her for a moment before continuing. "James needs someone patient, firm, and compassionate. Someone who won't run at the first sign of trouble." His gaze hardened slightly. "If you take this job, Ms. Alvarez, I need to know that you're committed." Alessia straightened in her seat. "I'm no stranger to challenges, Mr. Chandler. If I take this job, you have my word. I won't give up on James." For the first time, Chandler's expression softened. "Good," he said simply. "You'll start tomorrow." Before Alessia could fully process the conversation, the sound of hurried footsteps and a loud crash echoed from the second floor. Chandler sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "And that," he said wryly, "would be James." Before Alessia could respond, the boy in question appeared at the top of the grand staircase. 7 years old, but already radiating defiance, James Chandler leaned over the banister with a mischievous grin. His hair was dishevelled, and his eyes gleamed with a mix of curiosity and rebellion. "You must be the new nanny," James called out, his voice carrying through the marble foyer. "How long do you think you'll last? A week? Maybe 2? "James," Chandler said sharply, his tone a mix of authority and fatigue. "Come down here and say hello properly." James ignored his father and slid down the banister, landing with a thud on the polished floor. He walked up to Alessia and Heidi, his arms crossed as he looked them over. Alessia met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm Alessia," she said calmly, extending a hand. "And this is my daughter, Heidi." James glanced at her hand, but didn't take it. Instead, he turned his attention to Heidi. "Do you always bring your mum to job interviews?" he asked, smirking. Heidi frowned, stepping closer to her mother. "I'm not here for an interview. I'm here because we're going to live here," she replied, her small voice firm. James blinked, clearly caught off guard by her confidence, but quickly recovered. "Great," he muttered. "Another kid to deal with." "James, that's enough," Chandler interjected, his tone brooking no argument. "Go to your room. I'll speak with you later." James hesitated, his jaw tightening, but eventually turned and stomped up the stairs. The tension in the room lingered even after he disappeared. Chandler exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I apologize for his behavior," he said. "James has a lot of energy." Alessia shook her head. "It's fine, Mr. Chandler. I've dealt with stubborn kids before. I understand this won't be easy." "Call me Chandler," he said, a hint of a smile softening his otherwise serious demeanor. "And if you need anything, Mrs. Green, the housekeeper can assist you. She's been with the family for years and knows James well." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Green appeared in the doorway, her posture stiff but her eyes kind. She was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair neatly pinned back and an air of quiet efficiency. "Welcome, Ms. Alvarez," she said, nodding politely. "I'll show you to your rooms." "Thank you," Alessia replied, gathering her things and ushering Heidi to follow. As they ascended the grand staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Glancing back, she caught a glimpse of James peering around the corner of the hallway, his expression unreadable. Their assigned quarters were located in the east wing of the mansion, a comfortable suite with 2 bedrooms and a small sitting area. Alessia couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as Heidi bounced on the plush bed, her laughter filling the room. This was a far cry from the cramped apartment they had left behind. "It's like a palace, Mom," Heidi exclaimed. "Do you think James will let me play in his room?" Alessia smiled faintly, tucking a stray lock of Heidi's hair behind her ear. "We'll see, sweetheart. But remember, James might need some time to get used to us." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Green entered, carrying a tray with sandwiches and juice. "A little something to help you settle in," she said, setting the tray on the table. "And a word of advice, Ms. Alvarez. James is complicated. But if anyone can reach him, it might just be you." Alessia nodded, appreciating the encouragement. Once Mrs. Green left, she sat with Heidi at the small dining table, their first meal in the grandeur of their new home. That evening, as Alessia unpacked, she heard faint noises outside their suite. Stepping into the hallway, she found James sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers. He looked up at her with a mix of annoyance and embarrassment. "Lose something?" Alessia asked, crouching down to his level. James hesitated, then sighed. "It's nothing. Just some stuff I was working on." Alessia glanced at the papers, sketches of various animals, each one surprisingly detailed. "These are good," she said honestly. "Did you draw them?" James quickly scooped up the sketches, his cheeks reddening. "Yeah, so what?" "So nothing," Alessia said with a shrug. "They're impressive." James paused, clearly unsure how to respond. Finally he muttered, "Thanks," before darting back to his room. As Alessia returned to her own quarters, she felt a flicker of hope. Beneath James's defiance was a boy who needed someone to see him, to truly care. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the east wing, casting soft light onto Alessia's new surroundings. She rose early, eager to start her first full day in the Chandler household. Heidi was still asleep, nestled under a blanket that seemed far too luxurious compared to what they had back at their old apartment. Alessia allowed herself a moment to smile before getting ready. The day began in the expansive kitchen, where Mrs. Green was already bustling about, preparing breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. Alessia entered, greeting the housekeeper with a polite nod. "Good morning, Ms. Alvarez," Mrs. Green said with a warm smile. "Breakfast is almost ready. I've made some oatmeal and fruit for James, though whether he'll eat it is another matter entirely." Alessia laughed softly. "He doesn't seem like the oatmeal type." "You'd be right," Mrs. Green replied, her tone carrying a hint of exasperation. "He prefers sugary cereals and pastries, but Mr. Chandler insists on a balanced diet." As Alessia helped set the table, the sound of rapid footsteps announced James's arrival. He barreled into the kitchen, his hair unkempt and his expression as defiant as ever. Spotting Alessia, he froze for a moment before rolling his eyes. "You're still here," he muttered, sliding into a chair. "Good morning to you too, James," Alessia said, her tone even. She placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of him. "Eat up. You'll need energy for the day." James eyed the bowl with clear disdain. "I'm not eating that." Alessia sat across from him, meeting his gaze. "That's fine. But if you don't eat breakfast, you won't have the energy to outsmart me later." The challenge in her voice seemed to pique his interest. He scowled but picked up his spoon. Mrs. Green raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by Alessia's approach. As James begrudgingly ate his oatmeal, Chandler entered the kitchen, dressed sharply for a day of meetings. He paused, his eyes flicking between Alessia and his son. "Good morning," Chandler said, grabbing a cup of coffee. "How's everything going?" Alessia smiled. "So far, so good." James snorted, muttering under his breath, "We'll see about that." Chandler's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I'll be out for most of the day. Alessia, James has some schoolwork to catch up on. He's been avoiding it." Alessia nodded. "I'll make sure he gets it done." James groaned. "Great. Homework and oatmeal. Best day ever." After breakfast, Alessia followed James to his room, a spacious but cluttered sanctuary filled with books, toys, and scattered papers. His sketches, she noticed, were tucked carefully into a corner, as if they were the only things he truly valued. "All right, James," Alessia said, clapping her hands together. "Let's see what you've got for schoolwork." He flopped onto his bed, crossing his arms. "I don't feel like it." "Well, I don't feel like doing dishes," Alessia replied casually, "but sometimes we do things we don't like because it helps us grow." James shot her a glare but sat up. "Fine, but don't think this means I like you." Alessia chuckled. Noted. James pulled a crumpled math workbook from beneath a pile of comic books and tossed it onto the desk. Alessia sat down beside him, her demeanor calm but firm. She opened the book to a page filled with half-finished problems and pointed to the first question. "Let's start here," she said. "What's 5 times 7? James groaned, leaning back in his chair. "Why does this even matter? It's not like I'll use it in real life." "Well," Alessia said thoughtfully, What if you're an artist and you need to figure out how many paint tubes to buy for a project? Knowing how to multiply could help you. James's eyes flickered with interest, though he quickly masked it with a shrug. I'd just ask someone else. Maybe, Alessia conceded. But wouldn't it be cool to figure it out on your own? You'd be unstoppable. He hesitated, then leaned forward. 35, he muttered. Exactly, Alessia replied, smiling. See, you're already unstoppable. James rolled his eyes but didn't resist as they worked through the rest of the problems. Alessia noticed that once he started, his focus sharpened. He was quick to pick up patterns, and when he solved a particularly tricky equation, a small, almost imperceptible smile crept onto his face. When they finished, Alessia leaned back. You're pretty good at this, James. Maybe math's your hidden talent. Doubt it, he said, but there was no malice in his tone this time. As they wrapped up the session, Heidi wandered into the room, clutching a stuffed rabbit. What are you doing? She asked, her wide eyes scanning the desk. Homework, James grumbled. Can I help? Heidi asked, stepping closer. James snorted. You're a little kid. What do you know? Heidi frowned, undeterred. I'm good at spelling. Alessia watched as Heidi's innocent determination seemed to chip away at James's defenses. Finally, he shrugged. Fine. Spell giraffe. Giraffe, Heidi said confidently. James blinked, clearly surprised. Huh, lucky guess. Nope, Heidi said, grinning. I'm just smart. Alessia suppressed a laugh as James glanced at Heidi, his expression somewhere between begrudging respect and mild annoyance. Later that afternoon, Alessia found herself organizing the kitchen while James and Heidi played in the garden under Mrs. Green's watchful eye. She appreciated the brief quiet, using the time to reflect on the day's progress. While James had been resistant, she felt a shift, small but significant. He was beginning to let his guard down, even if only a little. The tranquility didn't last long. A sharp cry echoed from outside, and Alessia rushed to the garden. She found Heidi standing near the fountain, her face flushed with tears, while James hovered nearby, looking both guilty and defensive. What happened? Alessia demanded, her voice steady but firm. Heidi wanted to climb the fountain, James said quickly. I told her it was a bad idea, but she didn't listen. Heidi sniffled, pointing at James. He pushed me. I did not, James protested, his face turning red. I just tried to stop her. Mrs. Green stepped in, her tone calm. No one is hurt, and that's what matters. Let's take a moment to calm down. Alessia knelt beside Heidi, checking her for scrapes or bruises. Finding none, she looked up at James. If you were trying to help, thank you. But next time, use your words instead of your hands. James shuffled his feet, mumbling, Fine. As Alessia led Heidi back inside, she glanced over her shoulder at James. He lingered near the fountain, his posture tense. Alessia made a mental note to talk to him later, sensing there was more to his reaction than he let on. The rain returned with a steady rhythm the next day, tapping against the windows of the Chandler mansion. Alessia stood in the kitchen, preparing a tray of tea for herself and Mrs. Green, while her thoughts lingered on James. His progress with homework had been a small victory, but the incident at the fountain still gnawed at her. Something about his defensiveness didn't sit right. Her musings were interrupted by the sound of heels clicking on the marble floor. She turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed woman entering the kitchen. Her auburn hair was styled to perfection, and her sharp eyes scanned the room with the precision of someone used to control. Alessia instantly recognized her from the photos on the wall. Kelsey Harper, Chandler's sister-in-law. You must be Alessia, Kelsey said, her tone as polished as her appearance. I'm Kelsey, Charlotte's sister. Alessia extended a hand. It's nice to meet you, Ms. Harper. Kelsey's handshake was firm, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I've heard a lot about you," she said. "You've certainly made an impression, though I can't say I'm surprised Chandler hired someone inexperienced." Alessia felt the jab, but kept her composure. "I care about James, and I'm doing my best to support him." Kelsey's smile turned tight. "James is a complex child. He needs someone with a stronger hand, someone who understands his needs." Before Alessia could respond, James entered the kitchen, his expression lighting up when he saw Kelsey. "Aunt Kelsey!" he exclaimed, running to her side. Kelsey crouched to his level, her demeanor softening. "James, darling, how are you? Has this new nanny been treating you well?" James hesitated, glancing at Alessia. His shoulders tensed and he mumbled, "She's okay." Kelsey straightened, her gaze returning to Alessia. "Well, that's something, isn't it?" she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But don't worry, James. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Alessia clenched her fists, determined to stay professional. "I think James is doing well," she said. "He's been making progress, especially with his schoolwork." Kelsey arched an eyebrow. "Progress? That's good to hear, though I'm sure Chandler and I would have different definitions of that word." The tension in the room was palpable. James fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable. Alessia knelt down beside him, her voice gentle. "Why don't you show your aunt some of your drawings, James? I bet she'd love to see them." James brightened slightly. "Really?" "Of course," Alessia said, offering an encouraging smile. "Your work is amazing." James hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll get them." He darted out of the room, leaving Alessia and Kelsey alone. Kelsey's expression hardened the moment he left. "Let me make one thing clear, Ms. Alvarez," she said, her voice low. "James is my family. If I feel for 1 second that you're unfit for this job, I won't hesitate to have you removed." Alessia held Kelsey's gaze, refusing to flinch under the woman's scrutiny. "James is my priority," she said firmly. "I'm here to support him, not replace anyone." Kelsey's lips curled into a tight smile, one that barely masked her skepticism. "Good. Then we shouldn't have any problems." James returned moments later, clutching a handful of his sketches. His expression was a mix of excitement and apprehension as he handed them to Kelsey. "These are my favorite ones," he said softly. Kelsey flipped through the drawings, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "These are impressive," she said, though her tone lacked genuine praise. "You've always been talented, James." James's face lit up briefly before his expression faltered. Alessia noticed the subtle shift and stepped in. "James worked really hard on those," she said, her voice warm. "He has an incredible eye for detail." Kelsey's eyes flicked to Alessia, her smile tightening again. "Yes, well, he's always had potential. It's a shame it hasn't been nurtured properly." James's shoulders slumped and Alessia's chest tightened. "I think he's doing wonderfully," she said, her tone steady. "He just needs encouragement." Kelsey set the drawings down on the counter. "Encouragement is fine, but discipline is more important. James needs structure, rules, and consequences, things he hasn't been getting enough of." Alessia was about to respond when Chandler's voice cut through the tension. "Kelsey," he said as he entered the kitchen, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I thought I'd stop by to see James," Kelsey said smoothly. "It's been too long since I've visited my nephew." Chandler's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "I see. Well, James seems happy to see you." James, who had been silent during the exchange, looked up at his father and then at Kelsey. "Aunt Kelsey said she's going to take care of me," he said, his tone hesitant. Chandler's expression darkened, and he turned to his sister-in-law. "Kelsey, can we talk privately?" Of course, Kelsey said, her smile never wavering. She turned to James. Be good, darling. I'll be back soon. Chandler gestured for her to follow him out of the kitchen. As they left, James turned to Alessia, his eyes filled with uncertainty. She's right, isn't she? He asked. I don't follow the rules enough. Alessia knelt down to meet his gaze. James, following rules is important, but what matters more is trying your best. And I've seen you do that. You're learning and growing, and that's what counts. James hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, he said. But what if Aunt Kelsey doesn't think I'm good enough? Alessia's heart ached at his words. You are more than good enough, James, she said firmly. And I'll remind you of that as many times as you need. The following evening, Alessia found herself in James's room, tidying up the mess he had left behind after an impromptu art session. Sketches of animals and imaginary creatures were scattered across his desk and the floor. Some were so detailed that Alessia paused to admire them, marveling at the complexity and care James poured into his work. She carefully gathered the drawings into a neat stack, setting them aside on his desk. As she knelt to pick up a crumpled piece of paper near the bed, her hand brushed against something unusual. Pulling it out, she realized it wasn't just a scrap of paper. It was a folded envelope, its edges worn with time. The handwriting on the front caught her eye. To my James. Alessia's breath hitched as she recognized the familiar loops and flourishes of a mother's pen. She hesitated, her heart pounding. This was clearly something personal, something meant for James. But the envelope was open, and the contents had been partially pulled out, as though someone had abandoned reading it midway. Unable to quell her curiosity, Alessia unfolded the letter with deliberate care. The words inside were raw and emotional, a mix of apology and love. Charlotte's handwriting flowed across the page, expressing deep regret for the times she had been absent, physically or emotionally, during James's early years. She admitted her struggles with balancing the demands of motherhood and her own fears of inadequacy. The letter ended abruptly, with Charlotte promising to be better, to make it up to James. Alessia's throat tightened. The unfinished letter felt like a wound left open, a testament to a mother's inner conflict and her desire to do right by her child. For a moment she wondered if James had ever read this, or if he even understood the depth of his mother's feelings. The sound of footsteps startled her, and she quickly refolded the letter, tucking it back into the envelope. James appeared in the doorway, his expression wary. His gaze flicked to the envelope in her hand, and his eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it. "I was cleaning up," Alessia said calmly, rising to her feet. She held out the envelope. "I found this under your bed." James snatched the envelope from her hand, clutching it tightly. "You had no right to touch that," he said, his voice trembling. Alessia took a deep breath, her tone gentle. "I'm sorry, James. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. Just what?" James cut her off, his face flushed with anger. "It's none of your business." Alessia hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're right," she said finally. "It's your letter, and I respect that. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." James stared at her, his grip on the envelope tightening. After a long pause, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Alessia standing alone amidst the silence. Alessia exhaled slowly, her chest heavy with concern. She knew she had overstepped a boundary, but James's reaction revealed something deeper. The letter clearly meant more to him than just words on a page. It was a tether to his mother, a connection to a past he wasn't ready to share. Later that night, Alessia found herself in the kitchen with Mrs. Green. The housekeeper was preparing tea, her movements slow and deliberate. Alessia hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Green, can I ask you something about Charlotte?" Mrs. Green paused, glancing over her shoulder. "What would you like to know?" "James had a letter from her," Alessia said carefully. "It was unfinished, but it felt important. I think it's something he's been holding on to." Mrs. Green nodded, her expression softening. Charlotte was a complicated woman. She loved James deeply, but she struggled to show it. She was always so hard on herself, always worrying she wasn't good enough. That letter was probably her way of trying to make things right. Alessia leaned against the counter, absorbing Mrs. Green's words. "Do you think James understands that?" The older woman sighed. "He's just a boy, Alessia. Losing his mother the way he did. It's not something you recover from easily. That letter is likely his way of keeping her close, even if it hurts him." Alessia nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I want to help him, but I don't know how." Mrs. Green smiled gently. "Just be patient. Show him you're here for the long haul. That's what he needs. Consistency." The next morning, Alessia approached James with caution. He was in the garden, sketchpad in hand, his focus locked on a bird perched on a nearby branch. She waited until he glanced her way before speaking. "Hey, James," she said softly. "That's a great drawing. The details are amazing." James shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Thanks." Alessia crouched down, keeping her tone light. "I wanted to apologize for last night. I shouldn't have touched the letter. It was wrong of me." James stiffened, but he didn't walk away. Alessia took it as a small victory. "I know it's important to you," she continued, "and I just want you to know that it's okay to miss her. It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling." James's pencil stilled on the page, his brow furrowing. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered. "You don't know what it feels like to have someone leave and never come back." Alessia's heart ached at his words. "You're right," she said softly. "I don't know exactly how you feel, but I do know what it's like to carry something heavy, something that feels too big to share." James glanced at her, his eyes searching hers for a moment before looking away. "She didn't even finish the letter," he whispered. "She was going to, but she never got the chance." Alessia's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I think she wrote as much as she could, because she wanted you to know how much she loved you." James didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Alessia stayed with him in silence, watching as he returned to his sketching. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a start. The sun peeked through the clouds the next afternoon, casting a golden glow over the sprawling Chandler estate. Alessia had planned a relaxed day outdoors, hoping the fresh air might ease some of the tension lingering from the previous night. James and Heidi were in the garden, playing a makeshift game of tag around the towering oak trees, while Alessia watched from a nearby bench. "Careful around the fountain," she called out, her voice light but firm. She knew James's adventurous spirit and was wary after the incident earlier in the week. James shot her a mischievous grin, darting past Heidi and toward the fountain. He stopped abruptly, crouching to inspect something in the water, a small, brightly colored frog clinging to the edge of the stone basin. "Look!" he shouted, waving Alessia over. "It's so cool!" Alessia rose and approached cautiously. "That's a tree frog," she said, smiling at James's excitement. "They're not usually out during the day." James reached out toward the frog, but it hopped away, landing on a slippery section of the fountain's edge. Without hesitation, James leaned further over the basin to follow it. "James, be careful," Alessia warned, her voice sharpening. But it was too late. James's foot slipped on the damp grass, and in an instant he lost his balance, plunging into the shallow pool of the fountain with a loud splash. The shock on his face quickly turned to panic as he flailed in the water. "Help!" he cried, his voice trembling. "I can't!" Alessia's heart leapt as she rushed forward, diving into the fountain without a second thought. The water was colder than she expected, soaking her clothes as she grabbed James under the arms and pulled him upright. "You're okay, James," she said firmly, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I've got you." James clung to her, coughing and gasping for breath. His small frame shook, more from fear than the cold water. Alessia held him close, murmuring reassurances as she guided him out of the fountain and onto the grass. Heidi ran up, her face pale. "Is James okay?" she asked, her voice quivering. "He's fine," Alessia said, brushing wet hair from her face. She turned to James, who was sitting on the grass, his knees drawn to his chest. "Are you hurt?" James shook his head, still trembling. "I thought I was going to drown," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're safe now," Alessia said, crouching beside him. "I wouldn't let anything happen to you." For a moment, James said nothing. Then, to Alessia's surprise, he leaned against her, his small hands gripping her sleeve tightly. It was the first time he had sought comfort from her, and Alessia felt a pang of both relief and heartache. Alessia held James for a few moments longer, letting him calm down. His breathing steadied, though his grip on her sleeve remained tight. Heidi sat down next to them, her wide eyes filled with concern. "I'm sorry, James," Heidi said softly. "I didn't mean to scare you when I shouted." James glanced at her, his expression softening. "It's not your fault," he muttered. I didn't think I'd slip." Alessia gently pulled back, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Accidents happen," she said. "What's important is that you're okay, but you need to be more careful, especially around water. Can you promise me that?" James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I promise." Alessia smiled, brushing a strand of wet hair from his forehead. "Good. Now, why don't we get you and me out of these wet clothes before we catch colds?" With Mrs. Green's help, Alessia got James into dry clothes and wrapped him in a soft blanket on the couch. She brought him a warm mug of cocoa, which he accepted without his usual reluctance. Heidi sat beside him, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her lap. For the first time, James seemed relaxed. He wasn't trying to push anyone away or hide behind his usual bravado. Instead, he sat quietly, occasionally glancing at Alessia and Heidi as though testing the waters of trust. "You were really brave," Heidi said, breaking the silence. "Even when you were scared." James frowned, his fingers tightening around the mug. "I didn't feel brave," he admitted. "I felt helpless." "That's okay," Alessia said gently. "Sometimes being brave means asking for help when you need it." "And you did." James looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You really came in after me," he said. "You didn't even hesitate." "Of course I did," Alessia replied, her tone firm. "You're important, James. I'll always be there for you when you need me." His face reddened slightly, and he turned back to his cocoa. "Thanks," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. That evening, Alessia found Chandler waiting for her in the kitchen. His suit was slightly rumpled, his tie loosened, as though he had just come back from a long day. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "I heard what happened today," Chandler said. "Mrs. Green told me." Alessia braced herself. "It was my fault. I should have been watching him more closely." Chandler shook his head. "From what I understand, you were watching him, and you reacted quickly. Thank you for keeping him safe." Alessia relaxed slightly. "James is a good kid," she said. "He's just carrying a lot." Chandler nodded, his gaze distant. "He's been through more than any child should. Sometimes I don't know how to help him." "You're doing the best you can," Alessia said, her voice steady. And he knows you care, even if he doesn't always show it. Chandler hesitated, then gave her a small smile. He's lucky to have you here. We all are. As Alessia prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the day. The incident at the fountain had been terrifying, but it had also brought her closer to James. For the first time, she felt like she was truly making a difference, even if the road ahead was still uncertain. The days following the fountain incident brought a noticeable change in James. Though still guarded, he seemed less combative and more willing to engage with Alessia and Heidi. Small gestures, like nodding instead of rolling his eyes or lingering a moment longer during conversations, signaled progress. Alessia took these moments as quiet victories, though she knew the journey was far from over. One afternoon, Alessia found James in the study, hunched over his sketch pad. His pencil moved with purpose, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated. She stepped into the room, careful not to disturb him. "That's a pretty serious expression," she teased lightly. James glanced up, startled, then quickly covered his drawing. "I'm just practicing," he mumbled. Alessia smiled and sat down across from him, keeping a respectful distance. "I wasn't going to peek, but if you ever want to show me, I'd love to see your work." James hesitated, his hand lingering on the cover of the sketch pad. Finally, he flipped it open and turned the book toward her. Alessia leaned forward, her breath catching at the sight of an intricate drawing of a tree frog perched on the edge of a fountain. The details were meticulous, from the texture of the frog's skin to the reflection in the water below. "James," she said softly, "this is incredible." He ducked his head, his ears turning red. "It's not that good." "It's amazing," Alessia insisted. "You have such an eye for detail. Have you ever thought about showing these to someone, maybe even entering an art competition?" James frowned, his shoulders tensing. "Number, it's just for me." Alessia wanted to encourage him further, but decided not to push. Instead, she pointed to the drawing. "It reminds me of the fountain. You must have had a good view to get this just right." James shrugged, though there was a flicker of pride in his expression. "I guess." Before Alessia could say more, Heidi appeared in the doorway, holding a book nearly as big as her. "James," she chirped, "do you want to read this with me? It's about animals." James's initial reaction was to brush her off, but Alessia noticed a moment's hesitation. She smiled and added, "I bet you'd know more about those animals than the book does. You could even teach Heidi something new." James sighed but closed his sketchpad. "Fine, but only because I'm bored." Heidi beamed and plopped down next to him, opening the book. As they flipped through the pages, Alessia watched from her seat, a warm feeling settling over her. James's guarded walls were slowly, carefully being dismantled, brick by brick. The sound of James and Heidi's laughter echoed through the study as they debated the details of the animals in the book. James pointed out inaccuracies in the illustrations, and Heidi countered with questions that pushed him to explain further. Alessia stayed back, letting the two connect in their own way. It was a rare moment of ease for James, and she didn't want to interrupt it. After a while, Mrs. Green appeared at the door with a tray of snacks. "I thought you three might enjoy a little break," she said, placing the tray on the table. "Thanks, Mrs. Green," Heidi said, grabbing a cookie. James muttered his thanks as well, reaching for a slice of apple. Mrs. Green lingered, her gaze settling on James. "I see someone's in a good mood today," she said with a warm smile. James shrugged, but Alessia noticed the faint smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. It was small, but it was there. After their impromptu snack, James announced he was heading to the garden to sketch. Heidi followed, clutching her book, determined to keep James engaged. Alessia stayed behind with Mrs. Green, helping to tidy up the study. "You're making real progress with him," Mrs. Green said as she folded a blanket. Alessia shook her head modestly. It's not just me. Heidi's a big part of it too. He's starting to trust her. Trust is a big step, Mrs. Green agreed. Then her tone grew serious. But be careful, Alessia. Kelsey has been asking questions about you. Alessia froze, her hand stilling over the book she was stacking. Questions? Like what? She's been looking into your background, Mrs. Green said, lowering her voice. I don't think she's happy with how much James seems to be warming up to you. She's protective of him in her own way, but it's not always healthy. Alessia's stomach tightened. Why would she do that? I'm just trying to help. Mrs. Green gave her a sympathetic look. Because Kelsey doesn't like losing control, and right now you're someone she can't control. Alessia nodded slowly, her mind racing. She'd known Kelsey was wary of her, but the idea of being investigated felt invasive. Still, she couldn't let it distract her from what mattered. James. Later that evening, Alessia joined James and Heidi in the garden. James was sprawled on the grass, his sketchpad propped against his knees, while Heidi hunted for bugs nearby. The golden light of sunset bathed the scene, giving it a serene quality. Alessia sat down beside James, careful not to disturb him. What are you working on? She asked gently. James hesitated before turning the sketchpad toward her. It was a work in progress, a vibrant garden scene with flowers, trees, and a small girl chasing butterflies. Alessia recognized Heidi immediately. It's beautiful, she said, her voice filled with admiration. You've really captured the light. James ducked his head, his cheeks flushing. It's not done yet. Well, when it is, I'd love to see it, Alessia replied. She paused, then added, You know, you're not just good at drawing, James. You're good at noticing things, details that most people miss. James looked at her, his expression unreadable. I notice when people don't mean what they say, he said quietly. Like Aunt Kelsey. Alessia's breath caught, but she kept her tone neutral. What do you mean? James shrugged, returning to his drawing. She acts like she cares, but it's more about what she wants, not what's good for me. Alessia wanted to say more, but James had already retreated back into his art. She decided to let the moment pass, filing his words away for later. For now, it was enough that he had shared them. The morning began with an unexpected tension in the Chandler household. Alessia could feel it the moment she entered the kitchen, where Mrs. Green stood by the counter, her movements unusually stiff. The normally warm atmosphere seemed colder, the quiet unnerving. Alessia glanced around, her instincts sharpening. What's going on? She asked, her voice low. Mrs. Green hesitated, then sighed. Kelsey arrived earlier than expected. She's in the study with Mr. Chandler. I don't think it's a friendly visit. Alessia's stomach sank. Do you know why she's here? Mrs. Green shook her head. Something about James, as always, but she brought papers, legal ones. Alessia felt a chill run down her spine. She had known Kelsey was a threat, but this felt like a move beyond her usual manipulations. Steeling herself, she decided to check on James. She found him in the garden, perched on the edge of the fountain, his sketchpad forgotten beside him. His expression was distant, his shoulders hunched. Hey, Alessia said softly, sitting down beside him. What's on your mind? James didn't look at her. Aunt Kelsey's here, he said flatly. She told me she's going to fix everything. Alessia's heart ached at the confusion in his voice. What do you think she meant by that? James shrugged, his hands tightening into fists. I don't know, but whenever she says stuff like that, it's never about what I want. Alessia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Whatever happens, James, remember that you're allowed to have your own voice. You're allowed to say what you want. James looked at her then, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. Inside the study, Chandler's voice was raised, a sharp contrast to Kelsey's calm, calculated tone. Alessia approached the partially closed door, hesitating as their words reached her. "This isn't about what's best for James," Chandler snapped. "It's about you wanting control." Kelsey's reply was smooth, almost rehearsed. "I want what's best for my nephew, and frankly, Chandler, your judgment has been questionable. Bringing in someone like Alessia has been nothing but good for James," Chandler interrupted. "He's making progress because of her." "Progress?" Kelsey scoffed. "He's vulnerable, and you're letting a stranger play caretaker. It's irresponsible." Alessia's breath caught. She knew Kelsey didn't trust her, but hearing it spoken aloud stung. She moved away from the door, her mind racing. It wasn't just about her, it was about James. Kelsey's interference could undo everything they had worked so hard to build. She returned to the garden, where James was still sitting by the fountain. This time, his sketchpad was in his lap, and he was furiously scribbling. Alessia crouched beside him, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "James," she said gently, "no matter what anyone says, you're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone take away what makes you, you." James stopped drawing, his pencil hovering over the page. "What if I don't have a choice?" he asked quietly. "You always have a choice," Alessia replied firmly, "and I'll be here to remind you of that." The rest of the morning unfolded in uneasy silence. Alessia stayed close to James, subtly offering reassurance as he drifted between sketching and quiet contemplation. When Kelsey finally emerged from the study, her sharp gaze immediately fell on Alessia and James in the garden. She approached with her signature measured stride, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. "James," Kelsey said with a honeyed tone that belied her intent, "I need to speak with you for a moment." James stiffened, his pencil freezing mid-stroke. Alessia placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked softly. He hesitated, glancing between Alessia and his aunt. "It's okay," he said finally, though his voice wavered. "I'll talk to her." Alessia nodded, reluctantly stepping back as Kelsey led James toward a secluded corner of the garden. She watched from a distance, her instincts on high alert. Kelsey crouched to James's level, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. Whatever she was saying was out of Alessia's earshot, but James's hunched posture spoke volumes. He was uncomfortable, cornered. Unable to stand idly by, Alessia moved closer, keeping her steps quiet. As she approached, fragments of their conversation drifted toward her. "Your father thinks he knows what's best for you," Kelsey was saying, her tone soothing yet manipulative. "But he's too distracted with his work to really understand you. You need someone who can focus on you, who truly knows what you need." James shifted uncomfortably. "But Dad tries," he mumbled. "And Alessia, she listens." Kelsey's expression hardened for a brief moment before she plastered on a smile. "Alessia is a nice distraction, but she's not family. Family is what matters, James. I'm your family." Before Alessia could intervene, Chandler's voice rang out from the patio. "Kelsey!" he called, his tone sharp. "Inside! Now!" Kelsey straightened, her composure unshaken. "We'll continue this later, James," she said with a sweet smile. She turned and walked briskly toward the house, her demeanor unreadable. Alessia approached James cautiously. "Are you okay?" He nodded but wouldn't meet her eyes. "She just talks a lot." Alessia crouched down beside him. "James, you don't have to listen to anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. It's okay to speak up if you need to." James hesitated, then said, I just want her to leave me alone. Alessia's heart ached for him. I'll do everything I can to help make that happen, she promised. Later that evening, Chandler called Alessia into his office. The weariness in his eyes was unmistakable, but there was also a quiet determination. Kelsey's filing for temporary guardianship, he said without preamble. She's claiming I'm unfit to take care of James. Alessia's stomach dropped. That's ridiculous. You're doing everything you can for him. Apparently she doesn't think it's enough, Chandler replied bitterly. And she's using you as part of her argument. She says hiring a nanny shows I'm not capable of being a full-time parent. Alessia's hands clenched into fists. This isn't about what's best for James. It's about control. Chandler nodded grimly. I need your help, Alessia. Kelsey is going to do everything she can to manipulate James, to turn him against me. But he trusts you. You're the one person who can help him see the truth. Alessia took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. I'll do whatever it takes to protect James. Chandler offered a rare, genuine smile. Thank you, he said. We'll fight this together. That night, the weight of Kelsey's looming legal challenge hung heavy over the Chandler household. Alessia lay awake in her room, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the day in her mind. Kelsey's manipulative words, James's confusion, Chandler's quiet desperation. Despite her exhaustion, sleep refused to come. A soft knock at her door broke through the silence. Alessia sat up, her pulse quickening. Come in, she called quietly. Chandler stepped inside, his usual composed demeanor replaced by visible tension. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he rubbed the back of his neck as if trying to work out a knot of stress. Sorry to bother you, he said, his voice low. I needed to talk. Alessia gestured to the chair near her desk. Of course. What's on your mind? Chandler sank into the chair, exhaling heavily. This thing with Kelsey, it's not just about James. It's about Charlotte, too. She always wanted to control everything, just like her sister. Alessia leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Chandler hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. Charlotte was complicated. She loved James, but she struggled with motherhood. She felt like she wasn't enough, like she was constantly failing him, and Kelsey was always there, pointing out her mistakes, offering to help. He paused, his voice tightening. But it wasn't help. It was manipulation. Alessia listened intently, her heart aching for both Chandler and James. That must have been incredibly hard for both of you. It was, Chandler admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I tried to shield James from it, but when Charlotte died, it all fell apart. Kelsey swooped in, claiming she was just looking out for James. And maybe she convinced herself that's true, but it's not. She wants to control him, just like she tried to control Charlotte. Alessia reached out, resting a hand on his arm. You're doing everything you can for James, and he knows that. But Kelsey's not going to back down. We need to find a way to show her for who she really is. Chandler nodded, his jaw tightening. She's counting on James being too confused, too scared to stand up to her. But I won't let her win. Not this time. Alessia's resolve hardened. Neither will I. The next morning, Alessia found herself combing through boxes of family documents and mementos in the study. Chandler had given her permission to look for anything that might prove Kelsey's manipulations or her history of undermining Charlotte. As she sorted through old photo albums and letters, she stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of papers. Opening it, Alessia realized it belonged to Charlotte. The first few pages were filled with sketches and doodles, much like James's. But as she flipped further, the entries became more personal. Charlotte wrote about her struggles with anxiety, her fears of inadequacy as a mother, and her frustration with Kelsey's constant interference. One entry, dated just a month before her death, caught Alessia's attention. Charlotte described an argument with Kelsey over James's upbringing. Kelsey had suggested that James would be better off with her, claiming Chandler was too distracted by work to be a good father. Charlotte had dismissed the idea, but the entry ended with an ominous note. Kelsey always gets what she wants, one way or another. Alessia sat back, the weight of Charlotte's words settling over her. The journal painted a vivid picture of Kelsey's calculated interference, stretching back years. It was one thing to suspect Kelsey's manipulative nature, but seeing it confirmed in Charlotte's own hand made it undeniable. She closed the journal carefully, her mind racing. This could be the key to exposing Kelsey's true intentions. But she knew she had to tread carefully. Any misstep could jeopardize their case and further confuse James. Taking the journal, Alessia headed to Chandler's office. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing legal documents with a furrowed brow. The strain of the situation was evident in the way he rubbed his temples and the deep lines etched into his face. "Chandler," Alessia began softly, holding up the journal. "I think you need to see this." He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took the journal from her. As he flipped through the pages, his expression shifted from confusion to anger to sorrow. He lingered on the entry about Kelsey's argument with Charlotte, his grip on the journal tightening. "This—" Chandler's voice was low, almost a growl. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. She's been undermining our family for years, and now she's trying to take James away." Alessia nodded. "It's clear that Charlotte didn't trust Kelsey, and she was worried about the very situation we're in now. If we can show this to the court, it might help prove that Kelsey's actions aren't about James's well-being, they're about control." Chandler closed the journal, his expression hardening. "We'll use this, but we need more. Kelsey's smart. She'll twist this to make herself look like the victim if we're not careful." "I'll keep looking," Alessia said. "There might be more in the other boxes." Chandler's gaze softened, and he offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Alessia. I don't know what we'd do without you." Later that day, Alessia sat with James in the living room, the journal still fresh in her mind. She didn't want to overwhelm him with too much information, but she also knew he needed to feel empowered in the face of Kelsey's pressure. "James," she said gently, "can I ask you something?" He looked up from his sketch pad, his brow furrowed. "What?" "How do you feel about Aunt Kelsey wanting to spend more time with you?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. James hesitated, his pencil hovering over the page. "She says she wants to help," he said slowly. "But it feels weird, like she's trying to make me pick her over Dad." Alessia nodded, her heart aching for him. "You don't have to pick anyone, James. This is about what makes you feel safe and happy, and you're allowed to say what you want." James stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "I just want things to stay how they are now," he murmured, "with you and Heidi and Dad." Alessia smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "That's a good answer, and we're all here to make sure you're heard." As James returned to his drawing, Alessia felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had the truth on their side, and with the journal in hand, they had the means to fight back. The tension in the Chandler household was palpable the next morning as Alessia prepared breakfast. James sat at the table, idly stirring his cereal, his usual spark noticeably dimmer. Heidi sat beside him, trying to engage him with talk of her favorite books, but he barely responded. Chandler entered the kitchen, his expression grim but determined. He placed a hand on James's shoulder. "James, we need to talk about something important today," he said gently. "Your Aunt Kelsey has made some decisions that might affect us, But I need you to know that I'm here to protect you. James's hand froze over his cereal, and he looked up, his eyes wide with apprehension. What kind of decisions? Before Chandler could respond, the sound of sharp heels clicking against the tile floor announced Kelsey's arrival. She strode into the kitchen with an air of authority, her polished smile barely concealing her triumph. "Good morning, everyone," she said brightly, as if she hadn't spent the past few days dismantling the family's peace. "James, darling, I was hoping we could spend some time together today. There's so much I'd like to discuss with you." James glanced at Alessia, then back at his father, his small frame tensing. "I don't want to talk right now," he muttered. Kelsey's smile faltered for a brief moment before she crouched down beside James, her tone dripping with feigned concern. "I understand, sweetheart. This is all a little overwhelming, isn't it? But you can always trust me to look out for you." Alessia's fists clenched at her sides. She could see through Kelsey's act, but calling her out now would only escalate the situation. Instead, she caught Chandler's eye and gave a subtle nod. He straightened, stepping forward. "Kelsey, we need to talk," Chandler said firmly. "In private." Kelsey rose gracefully, smoothing her dress. "Of course," she said, her voice sweet but sharp. "Anything for James's well-being." As the two adults left the room, Alessia moved to sit beside James. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. James nodded, though his expression was conflicted. "Why is she doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't want things to change." Alessia placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes people think they're helping when they're not," she said. "But your voice matters, James. What you want is important, and we're going to make sure it's heard." In Chandler's office, the conversation between him and Kelsey quickly turned heated. Alessia lingered outside, straining to hear snippets of their argument. Chandler's voice carried frustration, while Kelsey's was calm, calculating. "You're pushing him too hard," Chandler said. "He's a child, Kelsey. This isn't about him. It's about you trying to control everything." "I'm trying to protect him," Kelsey countered. "Something you've failed to do." Alessia's heart pounded as the voices grew louder. She was about to step away when the door opened abruptly and Kelsey strode out, her face composed but her eyes flashing with anger. She paused when she saw Alessia. "Ms. Alvarez," Kelsey said smoothly, her tone laced with condescension. "I hope you're prepared for what's coming. This is bigger than you." Alessia held her ground, her voice steady. "I'm here for James. That's all that matters." Kelsey's smile was tight as she walked away, leaving Alessia standing in the hallway, her resolve stronger than ever. Alessia waited until Kelsey was out of sight before stepping into Chandler's office. He stood by the window, his back to her, one hand gripping the windowsill while the other raked through his hair. The tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. "How bad is it?" Alessia asked softly, closing the door behind her. Chandler turned, his expression a mix of frustration and worry. "She's filed an emergency motion for temporary guardianship," he said. "The hearing is in 3 days." Alessia's breath caught. 3 days. How is that even possible? "Kelsey's lawyers are pulling every string they can," Chandler said bitterly. "She's claiming I'm unfit and using the fact that I hired you as evidence. According to her, bringing in a nanny shows I'm incapable of being a full-time parent." Alessia's jaw tightened. "That's absurd. You've done nothing but fight for James." Chandler nodded, his voice softening. "She's also claiming I'm neglectful because of my work commitments. And now, with this hearing so soon, we barely have time to prepare." Alessia thought of Charlotte's journal, still tucked away in the study. "We have something," she said. "Charlotte's journal. It shows Kelsey's history of manipulation and proves that Charlotte didn't trust her." Chandler frowned. It's strong evidence, but we need more. Kelsey will argue that it's biased or irrelevant. We need something concrete, something that shows James's well-being is better here than it would be with her. Alessia's mind raced. What about James? He's old enough to have a say, isn't he? Chandler hesitated. He is, but I don't want to put that kind of pressure on him. He's already been through so much. Alessia stepped closer, her voice firm. You're not putting pressure on him, Chandler. You're giving him a chance to stand up for himself. He's been manipulated and silenced for too long. Maybe it's time he gets to speak. Chandler studied her for a long moment before nodding. You're right. I'll talk to him. But only if he feels ready. Later that evening, Alessia found James in his room, curled up on his bed with his sketch pad. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting shadows on the walls. She sat down at the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb him. Hey, she said gently. Can we talk for a minute? James looked up, his expression wary but curious. About what? About Aunt Kelsey, Alessia began. She's trying to change things that you've said you don't want to change. But your dad and I can't fight this alone. We need your help. James set down his sketch pad, his brows furrowing. What do you mean? I mean your voice matters, James, Alessia said. If you tell the court how you feel about what you want, they'll listen. But only if you're ready. James stared at her, his eyes wide. You want me to talk in court? Only if you want to, Alessia reassured him. No one can make you do anything you don't feel comfortable with. But if you're willing, it could make a big difference. James hesitated, his hands twisting in his lap. What if they don't believe me? They will, Alessia said firmly. Because you'll be telling the truth, and your dad and I will be right there with you. James was quiet for a long moment, then finally nodded. Okay, he whispered. I'll do it. As Alessia left James's room, she felt both relief and apprehension. They were asking a lot of him, but she knew he was stronger than he realized. The days ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the warmth of the Chandler home, a cold, imposing space where every word carried weight. Alessia sat beside Chandler at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. James sat between them, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair. His sketchpad, a constant source of comfort, rested on his lap, but he hadn't touched it since they arrived. Across the aisle, Kelsey sat with her lawyer, her demeanor poised and confident. She was dressed impeccably, every detail of her appearance carefully curated to exude competence and care. Alessia felt a surge of anger at the sight. Kelsey's polished exterior was a stark contrast to the turmoil she had caused. The judge entered, and everyone rose. As the hearing began, Kelsey's lawyer wasted no time laying out their case. He painted Chandler as a distant father, too consumed by his career to provide the stability James needed. Alessia's presence was framed as a further indictment of Chandler's parenting, a sign that he relied on outsiders rather than stepping up himself. When it was Kelsey's turn to speak, her voice dripped with feigned sincerity. James deserves the best possible environment to thrive, she said, addressing the judge directly. While I have nothing but respect for my brother-in-law's efforts, it's clear that his priorities lie elsewhere. As James's aunt, I only want to provide him with the stability and support he needs. Alessia clenched her fists, biting back the urge to interrupt. Kelsey's words twisted reality, presenting herself as a savior while subtly undermining everything Chandler had done for James. The judge's neutral expression gave no indication of how the arguments were being received. When Chandler was called to testify, he stood tall, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in his posture. He spoke about his love for James, his efforts to create a safe and nurturing home, and his commitment to being a present father despite the challenges of his work. Alessia felt a swell of pride as Chandler defended himself with quiet dignity. Then it was Alessia's turn. She rose, taking a deep breath as she approached the stand. The courtroom felt impossibly large, the eyes of every person fixed on her. "Ms. Alvarez," Kelsey's lawyer began, his tone sharp. "You've been employed as James Chandler's nanny for how long?" "About 3 months," Alessia replied, keeping her voice calm. "And in that time, would you say you've taken on responsibilities that should fall under Mr. Chandler's purview as a parent?" Alessia's gaze didn't waver. "I've supported Mr. Chandler as any caregiver would, but he's always been present and involved in James's life. My role has never been to replace him, only to assist." The lawyer's smile was thin. "Yet you've become a significant figure in James's daily life. Would you say he relies on you emotionally?" "Yes," Alessia said firmly, "but that doesn't diminish his father's role. If anything, it shows how much care Chandler has put into ensuring James has a stable, supportive environment." The lawyer pressed on, but Alessia held her ground, refusing to let his tactics rattle her. When her testimony ended, she returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier as the proceedings continued. Kelsey's lawyer called her back to the stand, where she launched into another performance of concern and martyrdom. "James is a bright, sensitive boy," she said, her tone thick with feigned emotion. "He deserves a family member who can be fully devoted to him. Chandler's reliance on a nanny, while understandable, shows a lack of personal investment. James needs stability, something I can provide." Alessia bit the inside of her cheek, her frustration simmering. Every word Kelsey spoke was a carefully crafted manipulation designed to paint her as the only viable choice for James's future. She glanced at Chandler, who was sitting rigidly beside her, his hands clenched into fists. Then came the moment Alessia had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The judge looked down at James, seated between his father and Alessia. "James," she said gently, "I understand this is a lot to ask, but I'd like to hear from you. If you're comfortable, can you tell us how you feel about everything that's been said today?" James froze, his wide eyes darting between the judge, Kelsey, and his father. Alessia leaned down, her voice soft and reassuring. "You can do this, James. Just be honest." James nodded, his small hands gripping the edges of his chair as he stood and walked to the stand. He climbed into the witness seat, his feet dangling above the floor, and clutched his sketchpad tightly. The judge smiled kindly. "Take your time, James. We're all here to listen." James swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him. "I don't want things to change," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I like living with my dad, and Alessia, and Heidi." Kelsey's lawyer leaned forward, his voice smooth but probing. "James, do you ever feel like your dad is too busy to spend time with you?" James hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but he always tries. He takes me to the park and we do puzzles together, and he listens when I tell him about my drawings." The lawyer's smile didn't falter. "And your Aunt Kelsey? She's been very involved in your life, hasn't she? Do you think she could take care of you if needed?" James looked at Kelsey, then back at the lawyer. His small hands tightened around his sketchpad. "She says she cares," he said slowly. "But it feels different, like she's trying to make me do things I don't want to do." The judge leaned forward, her tone encouraging. "James, what do you want? What would make you happy?" James took a deep breath, his voice trembling but steady. "I want to stay with my dad," he said. And Alessia and Heidi. They make me feel safe. A hush fell over the courtroom as James climbed down from the stand and returned to his seat. Chandler placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, his expression a mix of pride and relief. Alessia leaned closer, whispering, "You were brave, James. I'm so proud of you." Kelsey's composed facade finally cracked. Her jaw tightened and her eyes flashed with frustration as her lawyer whispered furiously in her ear. It was clear that James's testimony had shifted the tide. When the judge called for a recess, Chandler turned to Alessia. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Alessia shook her head. "You don't need to thank me. James is an incredible kid. He just needed a chance to be heard." The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as the hearing resumed after the recess. Kelsey sat rigid in her seat, her composed facade firmly back in place, though Alessia could see the cracks forming at the edges. Chandler, on the other hand, looked more resolute than ever. James's testimony had shifted the momentum, but there was still one final hurdle to overcome. The judge called the proceedings to order, and Kelsey's lawyer stood, his expression strained. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the child's preferences, it's important to consider the broader picture. Stability and long-term well-being must take precedence, and my client has demonstrated her capability to provide both." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Counselor. Mr. Chandler, do you have anything further to present?" Chandler rose, his movements deliberate and measured. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I'd like to submit additional evidence that provides insight into the relationship between my late wife, Charlotte, and her sister Kelsey." He gestured to Alessia, who handed the judge a copy of Charlotte's journal. The courtroom murmured as the judge flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she read the entries. Kelsey's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this journal is hearsay and should be inadmissible." Chandler's lawyer, who had remained quietly strategic throughout the proceedings, rose with a confident smile. "Your Honor, the journal is a first-hand account written by Charlotte Chandler, detailing her concerns about her sister's behavior and its impact on her family. It speaks directly to the issue of custody and Kelsey's motives." The judge considered this for a moment before nodding. "I'll allow it. Please continue." Chandler stepped forward, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "This journal shows a pattern of behavior from Kelsey that undermines the very stability she claims to provide. Charlotte's words paint a picture of manipulation and control, not support. My wife loved her sister, but she also saw the harm her interference caused." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't about what's best for James. It's about power. Kelsey doesn't want to care for James. She wants to control him." Kelsey's face remained calm, but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her lawyer leaned over, whispering furiously, but she shook her head, her jaw tightening. The judge turned to Kelsey. "Ms. Harper, would you like to respond?" Kelsey rose, her smile brittle. "Your Honor, I'm deeply saddened that my intentions are being misrepresented. I only want what's best for my nephew. If Charlotte had concerns, she never shared them with me directly. I find it suspicious that this journal has conveniently appeared now." Alessia fought the urge to stand up and object herself. Kelsey's measured tone was infuriating, a stark contrast to the turmoil she'd caused. The judge nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Harper. I'll take everything into consideration before making a ruling. Is there anything else?" Chandler's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mrs. Green, the family's longtime housekeeper, to testify." Kelsey's composure faltered for the first time. Mrs. Green had been a quiet observer throughout the hearing, but now she stepped forward, her expression calm but resolute. Mrs. Green walked to the stand with a steady, purposeful stride, her years of experience in the Chandler household reflected in her calm demeanor. After being sworn in, she folded her hands neatly in her lap and met the judge's gaze with unwavering confidence. "Mrs. Green," Chandler's lawyer began, "how long have you been employed by the Chandler family?" "Over 20 years, Mrs. Green replied, her voice clear and strong. "I've served both Mr. Chandler and his late wife Charlotte since before James was born." "And during that time, have you observed the interactions between Charlotte and her sister, Kelsey Harper?" Mrs. Green nodded. "Yes, I have." "Can you describe those interactions?" Mrs. Green hesitated for a brief moment, choosing her words carefully. Charlotte loved her sister, but their relationship was often strained. Kelsey had a habit of inserting herself into decisions that weren't hers to make, particularly when it came to James. It created a lot of tension in the household. Kelsey's lawyer quickly stood. "Objection, speculation." The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Green, please stick to specific observations." Mrs. Green inclined her head. "Of course, Your Honor. I personally witnessed Kelsey undermine Charlotte's decisions as a mother. For example, when Charlotte set boundaries for James, Kelsey would encourage him to disobey, framing it as being the fun aunt. It confused James and often left Charlotte feeling powerless. Did Charlotte ever express concerns to you about Kelsey's behavior?" the lawyer pressed. "Yes," Mrs. Green said firmly. "She confided in me several times that she felt Kelsey was trying to take over decisions that should have been hers and Chandler's. Charlotte worried that Kelsey didn't respect their role as James's parents." Kelsey shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her polished exterior beginning to crack. Her lawyer attempted to redirect. "Mrs. Green, would you say Kelsey's actions were motivated by malice, or could they have been well-intentioned but misinterpreted?" Mrs. Green met his gaze steadily. "I believe Kelsey thought she was doing what she believed was right, but her actions often caused more harm than good. She created division, not unity." The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Green, in your professional opinion, has Mr. Chandler provided a stable and nurturing environment for James?" Mrs. Green smiled warmly. "Absolutely. Chandler has always put James first. He's not perfect, but no parent is. What matters is that James knows he's loved, and Chandler shows that every day." "Thank you, Mrs. Green," Chandler's lawyer said. "No further questions." As Mrs. Green stepped down, the tension in the room was palpable. Alessia glanced at James, who was sitting a little taller, bolstered by the testimony in his father's favor. When the judge finally called for closing statements, both sides presented their final arguments with fervor. Kelsey's lawyer reiterated her claims of providing stability and the importance of familial bonds, while Chandler's lawyer emphasized James's testimony, Mrs. Green's account, and the evidence from Charlotte's journal. The judge sat silently for a long moment after the closing arguments, her pen tapping lightly on the desk. Finally, she spoke. "This has been a challenging case," she began. "It's clear that both parties care deeply about James's well-being, but this court must prioritize what is in the child's best interest. James has expressed a strong and consistent desire to remain with his father, and the evidence presented today supports that this environment is stable, nurturing, and aligned with his needs." She turned to Kelsey, her tone firm but measured. "While your intentions may be genuine, Ms. Harper, the court cannot overlook the concerns raised regarding your approach to this situation. Custody will remain with Mr. Chandler." A collective exhale swept through Chandler's side of the courtroom. Alessia reached for James's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Chandler placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice soft. "We did it, buddy." Kelsey, meanwhile, sat frozen in her seat, her expression a mix of shock and anger. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but quickly shut it, realizing the futility of further argument. She stood abruptly, gathering her belongings and exiting the courtroom without another word. As the judge adjourned the hearing, Alessia felt a wave of relief wash over her. The fight wasn't easy, but they had prevailed. More importantly, James's voice had been heard and his family remained intact. The days following the court's decision were a mix of relief and quiet reflection for the Chandler household. Alessia noticed a new lightness in the air, as though a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. James seemed more at ease, his laughter coming more freely, and Chandler carried himself with a calm confidence that had been absent for weeks. One crisp autumn morning, Alessia stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling pancakes filled the room as Heidi bounded in, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "James said he's going to show me his secret project today," she announced excitedly. Alessia smiled, setting a plate of pancakes on the table. "He did he?" "Well, that's a big deal. You must be very special to see his secret work." Heidi beamed, her excitement infectious. Moments later, James entered the kitchen, his sketchpad tucked under his arm. He hesitated at the doorway, glancing at Alessia, then at Heidi. "It's not ready yet," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Heidi tilted her head. "That's okay. I just want to see what you're working on." James's lips twitched into a small smile. "Okay, but only if you promise not to tell anyone." "I promise," Heidi said solemnly, placing a hand over her heart. Alessia watched as James led Heidi to the living room, his sketchpad held protectively. She couldn't hear their conversation, but Heidi's gasps of delight told her everything she needed to know. It warmed Alessia's heart to see James trusting someone so openly, a sign of how far he had come. Chandler entered the kitchen moments later, his hair still damp from a morning run. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his gaze drifting toward the living room. "He's different now," he said softly. "He's healing," Alessia replied, setting another plate of pancakes on the table. "You both are." Chandler nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's because of you. I don't know how we would have gotten through this without you." Alessia felt her cheeks warm, but shook her head. "It's not just me. James is stronger than he knows, and so are you." Chandler looked at her for a long moment, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Still, I'm grateful." That afternoon, Chandler called everyone into the garden for a surprise. Alessia, James, and Heidi followed him outside, where a picnic blanket had been spread beneath the sprawling oak tree. A basket of sandwiches, fruit, and cookies sat in the center, alongside a stack of board games. "What's all this?" James asked, his brow furrowed. "A celebration," Chandler said. "For us, for family." James's expression softened, and Heidi clapped her hands with excitement. "Can we play Monopoly?" she asked, already digging through the games. The afternoon passed in a haze of laughter and light-hearted banter. Alessia watched as James smiled more than she had ever seen, his walls finally crumbling as he allowed himself to enjoy the moment. Chandler was equally relaxed, his focus entirely on his children and the life they were building together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Chandler cleared his throat. "There's one more thing I wanted to say," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I realized something." Everyone turned to him, curious. "Family isn't just about blood," he said, his gaze sweeping over James, Heidi, and Alessia. "It's about the people who stand by you, who fight for you, and who make you stronger. And that's what we have here." Alessia felt a lump rise in her throat as Chandler turned to her, his expression earnest. "Alessia, you've been more than a nanny to us. You've been our anchor, our guide, and our friend. I can't imagine this family without you." Alessia's heart swelled at Chandler's words, and for a moment she was at a loss for how to respond. Before she could say anything, Heidi sprang to her feet, throwing her arms around Alessia's waist. "You're like our family now," she exclaimed, her small voice filled with conviction. James hesitated, his sketchpad clutched tightly in his hands. Then, in a gesture that spoke volumes, he stepped forward and extended the pad toward Alessia. "This is for you," he said quietly. Alessia took the sketchpad, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened it to find a beautifully detailed drawing of their little family. Chandler standing tall with his arm around Alessia, Heidi clutching her stuffed rabbit, and James holding his sketchpad with a shy smile. The background was their garden, with the familiar oak tree casting a protective shadow over them. "It's perfect," Alessia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at James, her eyes shining. "Thank you. This means so much to me." James shrugged, but a small, genuine smile crept onto his face. "You're welcome," he said, his voice steady. Chandler cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "There's one more thing I want to ask," he said, his eyes locked on Alessia's. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, holding it out toward her. Alessia's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Alessia," Chandler began, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You've changed our lives in ways I can't even begin to describe. You've brought us peace, laughter, and hope. I don't want to imagine a future without you in it. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Alessia's eyes as she looked at Chandler, then at James and Heidi, whose expressions were a mix of excitement and anticipation. She smiled through her tears, nodding as her voice finally found its way out. "Yes," she said, her heart full. "Of course, yes." The garden erupted in cheers. Heidi hugged Alessia tightly, while James stood beside her, his smile wide and genuine. Chandler slipped the ring onto her finger, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. As the evening wore on, the family sat together beneath the oak tree, the remnants of their picnic spread around them. The stars began to dot the night sky, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Alessia leaned against Chandler, Heidi curled up in her lap, and James beside them, his sketchpad resting on the grass. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright and full of promise. They had faced challenges that could have torn them apart, but instead they had grown stronger, bound together by love, trust, and the unshakable belief in the power of family. "Do you think things will always be this good?" James asked softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Chandler smiled, his arm around Alessia. "We'll have our ups and downs like any family, but as long as we stick together, we'll be okay." James nodded, his gaze drifting to the stars. "I think so too." Alessia looked at the faces around her, her heart swelling with gratitude. They had come so far, and she knew this was just the beginning of a beautiful journey. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family.